two coordinates, they take an image, they take another image, they run that through image analysis software, and that will subtract the one image from the other, and they're just left with a little dot. If that dot is there, it could be a comet, so they'll check it with somebody else. If they find the same dot and it's moved the next night, then they can work out the orbit.
Right. Well, I think that brings us nicely onto Planet X, or Nibiru, or any other name that you might want to call it. Just give us a background.
Yes, well, of course, Nibiru, this alleged, or one of the names, and actually discovered a new name recently. Hercolobus is another name for this. I hadn't come across that until recently, or Hercolobus or something.
A load of bollocks.
It sounds a bit like that, doesn't it? Yeah. Actually, yeah. So absolutely, so that the stories of Nibiru have come from various sources. The main one, to my understanding, being Zecharia Sitchin's books about called the Earth Chronicles series. He says that he's decoded the cylinder seals and the cuneiform tablets of the Sumerians, and they talk of a race of beings called the Anunnaki who came from Nibiru to the Earth, and they describe their home planet as a radiant planet, and various other characteristics about it. And they then said that this planet came close to the Earth and caused certain problems in the solar system, and then it moved. It's in a 3,600 year elliptical orbit.
Similar to a comet's orbit.
Yeah, if you look at the books, it's similar to a comet's orbit, an oval shaped orbit rather than a circle, basically, an elliptical orbit.
Allegedly several times larger than Earth.
Yeah, I forget the exact size that the Nibiru is alleged to be according to Sitchin, but it's I think maybe a couple of times bigger than the Earth. That sort of size, at least Earth sized, if not bigger. I forget the exact figures.
Now, if an object that size did come through an elliptical orbit, it would cause havoc with the Earth. The oceans would be jumping out onto the land, and the ice caps would be being pulled off, and all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
All kinds of things would be happening that wouldn't be very nice. Absolutely. Yeah. And people, of course, we've seen, for example, various. We actually have seen an increase in the number of earthquakes. That is true. The earthquakes appear to have increased in frequency over the last 20 years. For some unknown reason. I don't know the reason for it, and I don't know if anybody else does. And we've had similarly more extreme weather, which I think I know some of the reason for that. But of course, people wouldn't really want to talk about those reasons in the mainstream communities.
So just to get back to the alleged Planet X, the main sort of theory behind it comes from the Sumerian stone tablets.
Well, that I think is where it originated.
But it's my understanding that if it does have a 3,600 year orbit, it's currently nowhere near Earth at the moment.
Right. I mean, Sitchin spoke about this, and I think he didn't exactly say where it was. He didn't claim to know where it was, because he wasn't sure when it was last near to the inner solar system. And it's very difficult to get information about that. So he didn't sort of say that it was going to be seen in the skies at any particular point. I must stress that. However, there are a number of other websites which I've mentioned in this presentation. For example, Zeta Talk is one, and then there's Marshall Masters' website, which is YOWUSA, and there's various other websites. There's another chap called John Moore. He's talked a lot about this alleged Planet X being inbound. It's on its way in.
But they're not basing any of this on any actual evidence, Andrew, are they?
Apparently not. I mean, I had somebody write to me claiming to have I said, well, if this Planet X is in the solar system or near the solar system anywhere, please can you send me a picture? And I got this picture of a green ball. Right.
And just to go back to the Comet ISON discovery, if a Planet X is in our solar system and it's heading towards the Earth on a fairly elliptical orbit, we're going to see it maybe decades before it gets here.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely we are. And that's what I argued with this person who sent me this picture. And he claimed that this planet was, I think, 29,000 miles in diameter, and it was only 14 million miles away. Right. Which is closer than Mars. So I worked out that according to the figures that he gave me, that he said where it was, that it would be 40 times bigger in the sky than Mars is.
Right.
Now, you can't, obviously with your naked eye, you can't resolve Mars as a disk, but if it with you would be able to if it was 40 times bigger. I mean, if you put it into a telescope with 40 times magnification, you'd be starting to resolve Mars as a disk.
Now, just give me a comment on. I've had various people email me where they've taken a photograph of the sun during the day and they're saying, right, well, you can see there's an object there next to it, which is a small disk,
Right.
and that's Nibiru or Planet X.
Yes.
Just tell us about those.
Well, most people have sent me those same sorts of images too, and there are probably two main explanations for what those images show, or possibly three main explanations. One is a lens flare, so you get, for example, light being refracted inside the multiple elements of the lenses, and then because there's a little bit of a loss of light at each element of the lens, you can end up with this effect where the bright disk of the sun gets reflected and reflected and reflected, but then the angle, depending on the angle that the sun is coming into the lens, gets slightly off center, and so you'll see an actual disk of the sun slightly offset from where the real sun is on the image, and so you get this sort of lens flare or lens reflection. That's one effect, but it looks like it could be a real object.
Right. And if the sun was to move across the sky, would that visual artifact
that would move
as well?
Yeah, it would move.
So it would move.
Yeah, you would see that it would move, and you can see. In fact, somebody's even done a time lapse where you can see this effect.
Right.
The other effect that it can be is that some of the cheaper webcams, they have like an overexposure feature where if the image gets overexposed, the disk of the sun will appear black.
Right.
And some people have said, oh look, you can see Planet X, and you get little black disks from the reflection in the webcam lens as well, because that's also overexposed. So you'll get that. So those are two of the effects. But the third one is a sundog, where people will see you have the sun in roughly in one position, then 22.5 degrees away from the sun, you'll get the light refracted in cloud. And I've got. We'll put a picture in. I'll show you this picture I've got of a sundog, and you think it looks like another planet. It looks so weird.
And what about just touch on SOHO, which is the Solar Observatory, which is a probe or a craft between the Earth and the Sun, and it orbits at the same speed as the Earth, and it's monitoring the Sun. Now you can get those images online.
Right.
I've seen people claim to see Nibiru in those images.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the Nancy Lider is one of these. She's claimed that you can see Planet X in these SOHO images. Now, of course, people can make claims of these images, and they can say, "Oh, look, you can see Planet X. That's that dot there." But if you're claiming that that's a Planet X in that image and it's of a certain size, then point your telescope at it. When of course that's not always possible, because it might be in the field of view of the sun, but 6 months later, when we've moved around the sun and that's part of the sky is no longer in line with the sun, we can point the telescope at where that thing was, and if there really is a planet there, it might have moved a bit, but we should be able to see it, particularly if it's a big one. But no,
at some point it's going to be visible at night.
At some point it's going to be visible. At some point during the year, because we'll go right around the sun, so we can see all portions of the sky.
Right, okay, so we've debunked quite a bit today, Andrew. What about the 1983 IRIS probe, which was sent up and looked at the sky in infrared? And I heard that there was articles in mainstream press saying that in infrared it had seen a very large object in the outer reaches of the solar system. And I also read that scientists had measured perturbations in the movement of the outer planets, suggesting a 3 or 4 times Earth-sized objects in the outer reaches of the solar system. So,
absolutely, that's correct. And I was intrigued because I saw in the 1980s, I saw a Horizon BBC documentary. I used to watch them fairly religiously when I was that age, in those years. And they did a documentary about the IRIS probe, which, as you said, it took pictures of the sky from orbit, and it took them in the infrared.
Orbit.
Yeah, from Earth orbit. So you could see things outside, the Earth's atmosphere, and so you could look at objects which were very cool. Normally we don't get infrared radiation from space very much. In the lower atmosphere it gets all filtered out, gets absorbed in the air. So the IRIS probe could look at those cool objects. The sensor on IRIS itself had liquid nitrogen near it, so the sensor was very cool, so it could pick out these objects, and it did a great job. And for one particular story, they discovered this sort of blob of infrared radiation on an image. And I'm not quite sure why they thought this originally, but they thought it was an object in the solar system, perhaps because it was fairly large. So they thought because it was larger, it couldn't be too far away. But as it turned out, it was actually a gas, a knot of dust in Cirrus, and they didn't then report it. But the curious thing was with those stories
in another constellation.
In another constellation,
Right.
yeah. I think
So nowhere near our solar system.
Nowhere in our solar system, and that was later checked.
Are you sure about that? I mean, could that not be a cover-up, or?
Well, allegedly it could be a cover-up, but again, if it was really a planet in our solar system, we would have seen it by now, because 1983 was, we're talking 20 years ago now, 30 years ago.
30 years, yeah.
My maths is going on me. 30 years ago. So we've had much better equipment which has been scanning the sky ever since. The Hubble Space Telescope. We've had sophisticated radio astronomy techniques developed now. We've had these planetoids, as I say, much smaller objects detected out towards the orbit of Pluto, better amateur equipment. So we've had all kinds of developments, but they still haven't detected this planet. And also we've had the extrasolar planets have been detected. Mm-hmm. So it would be getting hard. It's now getting harder and harder to cover up the idea that there is a planet out there. Now there still could be. In other words, there could be a planet which is way out there, quite a long way distant, way out beyond Sedna, way out beyond these other objects, and only NASA knows about it. And they've got the equipment to detect it, and they could then control that information.
Right. But if it is there, it's probably quite a long way.
Yeah, I would say it's either very small or it's a long way off.
Are there any other notable people who speak about Planet X, and if so, what's their evidence?
Yeah, well, one of the people I came across a few years ago was this alleged professor, Jim McCanney. He runs a website, I think it's called jimmccannyscience.com, and he's been putting a lot of stuff on there. He's published several books. Gets on Coast to Coast a lot. And I think he does know something about physics, and he knows something about maths, and he does have a fairly good speaking style. He appears to know some of what he's talking about. But he has also talked about uncontrollable or irreversible global warming. He's into global warming and stuff like that. And he claims to be a weather expert as well. And he talks about Planet X, and he said, for example, I can read out a quote from him. Far out in the solar system, actually it's not a quote, this is what he said on Coast to Coast though, this was a synopsis of what he said. He talks about Planet X type objects which could become enshrouded in clouds of dust and gas and thus be hard to see, said McCanney. But he noted that a large object could be quite visible by the time it reached Pluto. Once in this position, such an object could take hundreds of years to approach Earth, or it could come in at a super speed in a matter of weeks, he warned. So pseudo-scientific, he's not really speaking in sort of definite terms or measurements that he's made. It's just speculation, and there's no evidence that he was a professor. But he also talks about this the sun being a solar capacitor. So he talks about the sun being charged up as a capacitor, and then when a comet comes in, it discharges the solar capacitor. Which sounds, like the electric universe theory, but they certainly don't use that terminology. And with McCanney talking about Planet X, and making these other claims, him sort of being described as a professor, but then not, and then he's talking about the electric universe, then is he, sort of being put out there to discredit some of the statements of the electric universe proponents? And I think that probably yes, he is.
Right, okay. Now I know a lot of people are convinced by this Planet X, so I'd like to throw out a challenge. Anyone who thinks Planet X is there, send Andrew or myself the evidence and we'll have a look at it. You can't say any more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what I said to people. One chap, and he did send me some pictures, but they clearly weren't Planet X.
Right.
He said he used a green filter on a Fuji camera to photograph this thing. Right. I mean, there's no way you'd put a green filter over a digital camera to photograph a planet. You're looking at it through a telescope, for heaven's sake.
Yeah, and just to push home the point that there are thousands of very, very capable amateur astronomers who are looking at the sky every night.
Yep.
So if they're not jumping up and down about it, it's probably not there.
Correct. That would be the thing that's totally swings it for me. That, in other words, NASA could cover it up, but thousands of amateurs, they would blow the whistle in a heartbeat. They want the fame that they've been trying to get for finding comets and things.
Right. Now, what about the theory that Nibiru is actually a satellite of a red dwarf? That it's have you heard that one?
I haven't particularly heard that one. I've heard that it's a radiant planet. I mean, that's what Sitchin writes about. So that, in other words, it gives off its own heat.
Right.
But Jupiter gives off its own heat as well.
Right. that there's something much bigger. It's in orbit, and the two of them come round.
Right, yes, I've heard that as well.
Right.
And there's another name given to it. There's also Nibiru, and then there's Tiamat, which is, I think, also it was meant to have been a planet in this solar system. And then there's another planet which Nibiru goes around.
And that explains the formation of the asteroid belt, does it not?
Well, potentially, yes. I mean, potentially there was, but possibly you could.
Because this all links into plate tectonics as well, doesn't it?
Possibly.
I mean, that's maybe another interview that
it is another interview
we can do, and it's another area of science that Andrew does not quite think we've been told the truth about.
Correct.
Right.
The formation of the Earth, or the way that the Earth has developed. But so there are stories, for example, that Nibiru crashed into another planet in our solar system and things broke off, and that's what formed the asteroid belt. Mars was the moon of another planet, and again, if you look at the orbit of Uranus, that's very unusual. Sorry, not the orbit, but the motion of Uranus, because it's tilted on its axis. So the pole of the planet is facing the sun, or facing away from the sun, rather than sort of perpendicular to the orbit.
Right. Well, let's go on to Richard Hoagland now. We've mentioned the orbit of Uranus, because. Where do we start with Richard Hoagland? Because we'll extend this interview because it's not on TV, Andrew. Okay, let's just roll with it. A lot of people contend that many of the NASA photographs on the surface of the moon can't possibly have been taken on the moon, and we touched on that a little bit in a previous interview. And there are some very credible researchers who have proved that some of the photographs can't have been taken on the moon, that the Apollo missions are supposed to have taken, and most of them are agreed that it's some kind of set on Earth where they've had, they've had everything set up. They've maybe taken some photographs. Whether or not they went or not, that's another argument. But some of the photographs are taken on Earth. Now, there are certain artifacts in the sky or in the backdrop which point to this. But Hoagland comes up with, I would say, a third position on this. Have you?
Right. Yeah, I've come across that. Correct.
Could you just explain that, Andrew?
Well, exactly. I mean, we would say from the other research that the Apollo missions, as we were showing them on the CV, were not real. That's not what happened. Something else happened with the Apollo missions, and we don't really know exactly what it is. So, if you come to that conclusion, as I have, then the films that we were shown must have been faked. And again, we talked a little bit about how perhaps Stanley Kubrick was involved, but basically we were looking at a movie set. Yeah, and
I'll just put on the screen, Andrew. If you don't believe that, folks, just go and watch this show. It's the hyperlinks on the site on the page now. But carry on.
Okay, and so basically, if we were watching a movie set, then if you, for example, were taking pictures of that movie set, and then as Richard Hoagland does, you take those pictures and you turn up the contrast, and you see all these grid structures in the back of the photograph, then what are you actually seeing? Are you seeing, as Hoagland claims, these huge structures that are 3 miles high, glass domes and structures and grids and so on, or are you seeing the struts and the supports behind the black curtains that were holding up the black curtains?
Right. So, in other words, he's creating a second conspiracy to try and explain the same anomaly. Yes. And his conspiracy is that no, it was taken on the moon. It's just that those artifacts are in fact some huge glass wall on the moon.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
That's what he alleges.
He might be right. Yes. But we think there's maybe a reason why he's coming out with things like that.
Right, and I mean, it appears from what you and I have discussed before, Richard, and looking at what Richard Hoagland has put out, that he has put out some very interesting information, but then almost in the next breath, sometimes it's just utter rubbish that he'll come out with. And he's done this particularly as I've written about at quite some length with Dr. Judy Wood's research. He tried to present that at a conference, and he made a number of serious errors, whereas some of it was okay, but most of it was wrong. So we have to ask ourselves: is the guy, is he clever? Is he dumb? Is he deliberately putting out false information to mislead people?
Right. Well, I sat through his 2011 Exopolitics talk about Comet Elenin, and about how he thinks it's an artificial object, or was an artificial object, that had been launched at some point by some advanced civilization to come back to the Earth and
Right.
give us all a message. And the evidence that he used to try and prove all of this, it was in numerology.
Yes.
So he was looking at times of the day that something happened and comparing that with angles that a triangle intersects a circle and this kind of stuff.
That's right. I mean, I think we gave the example, we should check this really, but he said, I think the comet was discovered at a time of 1951 in the evening. That was the alleged, either the time of discovery or the time of perihelion, the closest approach. And then he goes on to say in the next breath, well, 1951, that's 19.5, which is the hyperdimensional angle.
19.47, I think it might be.
Well, yes, it is, but
it's a hyperdimensional angle.
Hyperdimensional angle, that's what it was. And then he went on to say, and I was listening to this last night or the night before, and he said that the perihelion date was September the 11th, so therefore it had to be engineered that it was going to be perihelion on September the 11th.
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, let's just...
But the problem is, I mean, people are, you know, I mean, I'm quite interested in numerology. We discussed this a bit earlier, but unless you've got some other evidence to back that up as well, you know, it's ridiculous just to do it on that basis. Unless you can show, for example, 3 or 4 amateur astronomers have photographed this comet, and they've both seen that it's got unusual characteristics compared to similar comets, but he didn't have any evidence like that.
Right. So Comet Elenin, do you know what eventually happened to it, Andrew? Did it land on planet Earth and occupants get out?
That's the thing. I think, as far as I'm aware, Comet Elenin just did what all the other comets do. I think it had a brief apparition for a few months, and then it faded away into obscurity.
Right.
As far as I'm aware, I certainly haven't seen any other evidence that anything came out of it, or you know, people have claimed that, for example, that Comet Ison changed orbit when it went past Mars. Well, not as I understand.
Ison or Elenin?
Well, Ison, you know, going back to Comet Ison, they claimed on the internet that its orbit had changed when it went past Mars because it had a close encounter with Mars. Right.
It's well, if it comes near to a large body, it will affect its path.
Yeah, if it was strong enough, but Mars is pretty small, so it wouldn't have significantly affected it.
All right. So just to wrap up then, Andrew, you would say that